When Alex entered the room, I was sitting on Daniel's lap, my boss, and his hands were shamelessly sliding down my thighs. My husband's face went pale, and for a moment I felt cold joy at the way he froze on the threshold. Even at that moment, he didn't say a word. Just stood there as he always does, a weakling. "Oh, Alex," Daniel smiled lazily, playing with the strap of my bra, which had long since been on the floor. "You've come at a bad time, buddy." He picked up the underwear with the toe of his boot, tossing it in my husband's direction like it was trash. Alex stared at the floor and fiddled with his eyes, as if looking for somewhere to hide. His shoulders shook, and I saw him swallow, not knowing what to say or do. I expected at least a flash of rage, at least a scream, but nothing followed. "I'm sorry," he barely audibly muttered, retreating to the door as if it was his fault he'd caught me on another man's lap. Daniel grinned, savoring the humiliation that was unfolding right before his eyes. He leaned over to me and whispered in my ear, "Are you sure you want to stay with him? That guy can't even stand up for you."
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
I was stunned. On the one hand, I had long despised Alex for his weakness, for his inability to be the man I deserved. On the other hand, this public humiliation, this moment of absolute defeat was some kind of perverse confirmation to me that I was right. I needed someone strong, someone who could take me on and protect me, but not Alex. The door closed behind him with a quiet click, and silence hung in the room. Daniel stood up, stretching, as if satisfied with the result of the little play we'd put on. "So, shall we get back to our business?" After Alex left, I sat in Daniel's office, a complete discord of emotions filling me. I watched as Daniel stretched again, glancing at me mockingly. His gestures were confident, almost arrogant, and I knew he was enjoying the situation. As if in some kind of nightmare, I couldn't take my eyes off his face, which expressed utter contempt for my husband. "You look amazing," Daniel said, his eyes sparkling in the shadows of the office lights. "I hope it's not too damaging to your well-being." I felt torn between relief and guilt. It was hard for me to realize I was taking pleasure in such humiliation, but his words were like a drug and I couldn't stop. In the back of my mind, I realized that I had shown my true nature with this act, which was really what I was unhappy with in our marriage. "You know," Daniel continued, his voice becoming more intimate, "I feel like your husband will never be able to give you what I can." I didn't respond, though his words penetrated my very soul. All these months spent in this fruitless marriage, the perfect image of what I really want had been looming in my mind. And what I experienced today was a revelation, something deeper that I may have feared. The fact that Daniel could demonstrate his superiority so openly, and the fact that Alex couldn't do anything about it, gave me a strange sense of power. How easy it was to tear and reshape lives for my own pleasures. I could feel my own feelings becoming part of this twisted spectacle. Daniel, noticing my satisfaction, leaned toward me and whispered, "Are you sure you want to continue living with that lowlife? That guy can't even stand up for you." I felt his words penetrating my consciousness, and I nodded inwardly, already realizing that the choice had been made. The next day, when Alex came home, he was like a shadow of himself. He didn't dare to meet my eyes, and his politeness was so contrived that I could hardly stand it. He didn't say a word about what had happened, as if it had all been nothing more than an ominous dream. I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the storm was raging inside me. Every look he gave me, every word, seemed almost insulting, a reminder of his own defeat. I watched him try to restore the normal rhythm of our lives, but it all seemed foolish and pathetic. Soon I noticed how Alex, in his quest to be a good husband, became even more compliant. He complied with all my requests, trying to be comfortable and please, even when it became absurd. His helplessness only emphasized my contempt. Daniel, on the other hand, continued to demonstrate his power. He knew he had me on a short leash and used that to his advantage. Our relationship became more and more intense, and I couldn't resist his dominant nature. Each day spent with Daniel became more and more fulfilling and intense. His dominance and confidence made him almost irresistible, and I became increasingly lost in the chaos. He knew how to use my weaknesses and fears to bend me to his will. "You do realize that you're just a toy to me, don't you?" he asked, and his gaze was full of mockery. His words were like sharp knives piercing my self-respect. I felt like a puppet twitching under the control of his hands, and every touch from him only made it feel worse. Alex, on the other hand, though he tried to be understanding, couldn't hide his distressed state. His silence and mute rage only emphasized his weakness. Every time I looked at him, I saw him suffering from his own powerlessness, and it only strengthened my sense of superiority. However, each day it became harder and harder to ignore the internal strife. I began to doubt that this was a path I really wanted to continue on. But the fear of losing Daniel and his unpredictable nature kept me staying in this hell. As time went on, Daniel became more and more persistent. I noticed that he was beginning to manipulate the situation, creating tension between us that only served to further solidify his control. Sometimes he made me feel guilty for my own behavior, blaming me for my disobedience, and other times he used his power to satisfy his own needs. Alex, in turn, became increasingly invisible in his own life. His presence in the house became something familiar, but devoid of any meaning. He didn't challenge my decisions. He didn't express his opinions. His existence became a formality, and I was increasingly torn between guilt and the desire to continue what had begun with Daniel. Things were only getting more complicated. Daniel was showing his true colors more and more often, and his demands were becoming more and more violent. I felt like I was trapped in a trap where every move and every word was designed to subjugate me completely. "You must obey me without question," he said one day when I dared to express my doubts. His gaze was determined and his voice was cold and unyielding. I could feel his words making me feel even more helpless. In this chaos, I was beginning to realize that my own feelings and desires were beginning to fade under the pressure of his control. I felt like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings, and each new display of power from Daniel became more and more overwhelming. When I tried to discuss our relationship with Alex, he only shook his head and said, "You made your choice." It was painful but also true. I realized that now that I was fully immersed in Daniel's world, any resistance would only make my situation more difficult. Along with the fact that as I became more and more consumed with my relationship with Daniel, the internal conflicts only intensified. I knew that his power and manipulation was destroying me, but it was also becoming part of my new world at the same time. Every order he gave and every show of power only confirmed that I had become a part of it. "You want to be free, but deep down you know you can't walk away from me," he spoke with smug confidence. I could feel his words seeping into my mind, becoming an immutable truth. My attempts to ignore my own feelings were only complicating my situation. I continued to get lost in this emotional chaos, and each new display of power from Daniel became more overwhelming. I felt like I was losing control of my life. The internal tension was peaking, and I realized that I couldn't stay in this state forever. I had to find a way to cope, or I had to completely absorb myself into the world Danielle was creating. But despite my best efforts, I continued to stay in this vicious cycle. The day came when Daniel decided to finally demonstrate his power. He invited Alex to meet and discuss the situation, which I realized was simply an act of public humiliation. The meeting took place in a restaurant, and I was invited to observe the spectacle. Alex sat across from Daniel, his face covered in fear and indecision. Daniel, with confidence and grace, was defiantly playing with his thoughts like a cat with a mouse. He began to ask questions that made Alex sink even further into the abyss of humiliation. In every word he said, you could feel the desire to show superiority. After the meeting, as we drove home, Alex was completely broken. His tears and helplessness were a sign to me that I had made the right choice, even though I was struggling internally. I knew something had to be done about it, but I wasn't sure I was ready for a change. The aftermath of the day was devastating. Alex was unable to recover from the humiliation he had suffered. His condition worsened, and I realized that a decision had to be made. My life with Daniel continued to go downhill, but I began to realize that the person I needed, and who could truly give me what I was looking for, was no longer there. The events of the last few weeks had shown me that both Daniel and Alex were just parts of my internal struggle. I ventured into a frank conversation with Daniel, in which I confessed my doubts and my desire for change. It was the beginning of a new phase in which I would have to find my place in life and make choices that would affect my future. Each day with Daniel became more and more intense with his manipulation and playing on my feelings. His confidence and dominance became a part of my existence, and I felt more and more like my life had become his game. He knew how to manipulate my fears and desires, turning them into tools of his control. "Do you realize that I can give you anything you dream of?" he repeated often, looking at me with a troubled confidence. His words were sweet, but their meaning was full of power and control. I could feel his power turning into a drug, and I became addicted to his approval. Each day with Daniel became more and more emotionally intense. He used his power to keep my attention by manipulating me and my desires. I knew I had allowed this to happen myself, but I couldn't stop. I realized that he had brought me to a state where I could no longer distinguish between my true desires and those imposed by him. "Are you sure you want to continue with him?" Daniel whispered as I expressed my doubts. I realized his words were becoming the truth, and I knew inwardly that he was right. I was trapped in a trap created by my own decisions and desires. After we discussed our feelings, I made the decision to stay with Daniel. That night was full of passion, and every touch from him felt like a reminder that I had made a choice in his favor. In his presence, I was losing all vestiges of control over myself, completely immersed in his dominance. "Do you realize that I can give you everything you dream of?" he repeated, and I felt his words become part of my essence. This realization was like a cold shower, but I couldn't stop. Every order he gave and every show of power only strengthened my position. Alex, though he tried to maintain contact, remained in the shadows of my past. His weakness and indecisiveness became even more visible, and it emphasized my inner destruction. I realized that despite all the difficulties, I could find my way to freedom. I began to slowly rebuild my life by learning to deal with the consequences of my decisions. It was difficult, but I knew that each attempt to return to normalcy was a step toward my freedom. I realized that I now had to create a new life for myself and learn to deal with what was left of my past. The next few weeks were filled with tumultuous emotions and realizations. I realized that I could no longer continue to live in this gap between my desires and reality. I noticed that Daniel, despite his outward confidence and authority, was beginning to show signs of dissatisfaction. His manipulation and dominance now seemed less appealing than before. With each passing day, I could feel the internal conflict building up more and more. I continued to be under Daniel's influence, but I also began to realize that his attraction was becoming a heavy burden. His control over me was slowly turning into chains I had placed on myself. One evening, when Daniel was particularly insistent in his demands, I decided to make a decision. I invited him to our country place where we could talk privately, away from prying eyes and constant pressure. When we arrived at the country house, I could see Daniel sensing the atmosphere of privacy as a chance to exercise even more power. We settled into the living room and I tried to start a conversation. "Danielle, I need to talk about us," I began, trying to remain calm. "About what happened and how I feel." He looked at me with interest and smugness. "What, you're having doubts?" "Yes," I admitted. "I realize you gave me what I wanted, but now I'm not sure it's all I'm looking for. I feel confined, like a cage I built for myself." Danielle frowned. "Are you disappointed with me? Or maybe your regret has to do with the way things went with your husband?" It's not just that, I replied, struggling to find the words. I can't figure out what's important to me. I've started to realize that our relationship doesn't give me freedom, but only complicates my inner state. Daniel hadn't expected such an answer. His face turned serious for a moment, and I could see his confidence begin to crumble. Are you sure you understand what you want? If you really understood, you wouldn't be having these doubts. As I tried to pull myself out of the darkness I'd plunged myself into, Daniel continued to manipulate my emotions as if it was his game. His power and confidence became more and more overwhelming, and I felt like I had become completely dependent on him. Each day his control became more and more brutal, and I was lost in this dark vortex. You should know that you're worthless without me, he said with a cold sneer. His words were like knives tearing through my sense of self. I realized that I was becoming part of his strategy of total submission. His words left no room for doubt, and I could feel my own feelings becoming even more confused and disordered. Alex, on the other hand, looked increasingly depressed and alienated. His attempts to maintain our relationship seemed pathetic and insignificant. With every word he said, I could see how his weakness emphasized my inner decay. I felt my inner conflicts becoming more and more acute, and any attempt to get back on track only made things more difficult. I tried to seek solace in my attachment to Daniel, but it became part of his plan to control and manipulate me. His every demand and every show of power only destroyed me from the inside out. I realized I was trapped, and the fear of breaking free only made my situation worse. The next few days were spent in reflection and introspection. I spent time thinking about my priorities and what was really important to me. I needed to find a way to free myself from this inner chaos and find my path. My conversation with Daniel showed me that I needed time to sort myself out. I decided to take a step back to reevaluate my life and find clarity. I let Daniel know that I needed time to sort out my feelings, and he agreed to give me space, albeit with some resentment. When I tried to find comfort or at least understanding from Daniel, he only threatened increased control. You have to know your place, he would say when I dared to protest his demands. His words were an icy shower of affirmation that I was not entitled to my own opinion or feelings. His manipulations continued to deepen, and I realized that I was becoming part of his strategy of total submission. Every word he said and every action he took reinforced my sense of dependency, and I became increasingly lost in this emotional chaos. I realized that now all my actions and thoughts were focused on satisfying his desires rather than my own needs. When Alex tried to intervene and express his grievances again, it only emphasized my inner discord. His weakness and indecisiveness was becoming even more apparent, and it only exacerbated my sense of Daniel's superiority and control. I could see him losing hope, and it was painful for me. I realized that my inner state was like a scale where one scale was getting heavier and heavier and the other was getting emptier. My desire for control and submission to Daniel was becoming more and more apparent, and I didn't know how to find a way out of this trap. Back home, I tried to build a relationship with Alex. I realized that he was deeply hurt, and his helplessness was not only a result of my actions, but also of his own weaknesses. I began to be patient and understanding, trying to restore some connection between us. Alex, although still depressed, began to show signs of improvement. He became more open about his feelings and fears, and this gave us a chance to discuss our future. I realized that I couldn't change the past, but I could try to fix what could be fixed. Despite my best efforts, I realized that I was on the verge of total submission. Daniel continued to demonstrate his superiority, and I was becoming more and more dependent on his approval. I realized that all my previous beliefs and hopes were shattered, and each new day brought new challenges. You must realize that your life belongs to me now, he often repeated, and I felt his words become part of my essence. This realization was both agonizing and exciting, and I couldn't deal with this internal conflict. Alex, on the other hand, seemed increasingly detached. His attempts to maintain the previous relationship and discuss our problems seemed empty and insignificant. He became another victim in this emotional chaos, and his suffering only emphasized my own inner destruction. I realized that my inner state had become like a scale where one scale was getting heavier and heavier and the other was becoming empty. I realized that I was trapped and every resistance only made my situation worse. I continued to suffer in this emotional hell, not knowing how to find a way out. Just when I thought I had reached my limit, Daniel began to show interest in another woman. This new rival became a part of his life, and I could feel my position becoming even more vulnerable. I watched him immerse himself in this new relationship, and it was the final blow to my self-esteem. "She's better than you," he said one day when I tried to express my feelings. Those words were like a blow under my breath, and I felt my inner state crumbling. I realized that I had become just one of many, and it was agonizing. When things reached a tipping point, I realized that staying with Daniel had become unbearable. His domination and manipulation had destroyed everything that had once been part of my inner world. I felt like I had become a shadow of my former life, and each new manifestation of his power only made my condition worse. "Now you have to realize that I'm using you as a toy," he said as I tried to express my emotions. Those words were like an ice shower, confirming that I had become part of his dark world. I realized that despite my best efforts, I was still trapped in a place I couldn't leave. Alex, though he tried to keep in touch, remained in the shadows of my past. His weakness and indecision only emphasized my inner destruction. I realized that my previous attempts to return to normalcy had been futile, and I had to make a new choice. I began to realize that every moment of submission and manipulation was only destroying me from the inside out. I tried to find a way to change my life, but my inner fears and addiction only made things more difficult. I continued to suffer in this emotional hell, and any resistance only made things worse. After months of reflection and working on myself, I came to the conclusion that I needed to make a change. I decided to leave Daniel and focus on rebuilding my life and relationship with Alex. It was a difficult decision, but I knew it was the right one. Alex and I were starting a new phase in our lives. We couldn't bring things back to the way they were before, but we could try to build something new based on understanding and mutual respect. It wasn't an easy path, but I was willing to take it. Years later, I could look back on that time as an important stage in my life. The experiences I had gone through had taught me a lot. I learned the value of real relationships and the realization that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the ability to be honest and open. Alex and I, while not completely bringing back the old relationship, found a new understanding of each other. I began to be more attentive to my own wants and needs, learning to be honest with myself and others.